Final Fantasy XIV. I really like Final Fantasy XIV. It has great bosses, incredible music, and a vast world to explore. But the thing I find most interesting about 14 is the sheer scale of its story. Truly hundreds of hours of continuous story developed over the course of a decade, all of which fits together to create an epic almost unseen across all video games. There is, however, a slew of problems that can arise when you make a game of this size. There are the obvious things like maintaining a coherent theme and acting on a unified vision, both of which 14 tackles with some great degree of success. The story definitely wavers in its early moments, with no clear formula for success before Heavensward, and no true unifying vision until around Shadowbringers, when the true scale of the Saga of Light and Darkness comes into view. But despite these hiccups, it stays interesting throughout, and does an extraordinary job weaving early moments into later storylines to make the whole story better. But I digress. If given the opportunity, I could talk about the different problems 14 has all day. The fact is, creating a story of such magnitude is one of the hardest things one can do. And of all the issues that emerge in it, one stands out as the most interesting, to me at least. To put it simply, Final Fantasy XIV has a character problem. In any narrative, a character is the basic unit of story. Characters are what act upon the world, make decisions, and change things. Characters are also the people who experience emotions and afflict emotions upon the audience. All character actions and perspectives shared are by characters, and so we must look to characters when trying to build a story. Yet not every character can fit into every story. You can't place a mime in the middle of a gritty war film. Well, you can, but that would require a lot of explanation. Characters require some investment in the story, context, or backstory that informs their role. They also need motivations, reasons for which they act and push through the adversity the story presents them with. These are all pretty basic considerations, most of which are handled in the story's initial conception. Why is Aymeric here? Well, he's the leader of the Temple Knights. Why does he care about the war? Because it threatens his home. Yet as the story moves beyond its initial conception, the characters must also grow with it. And here's where the problem arises. A Final Fantasy XIV expansion has a few requirements. You got a handful of new dungeons, a raid series or two, and most importantly, a new land to explore. In each 14 expansion, we visit an entirely new land, interacting with its people and working to solve the great and terrible new problems that afflict them. From the Dragonsword War of Ishgard in Heavensward to the rampant light of the First in Shadowbringers. In every expansion, we travel further afield, facing new adversity and tackling new adventures. And for most characters, this is the end. We will be introduced to a new roster of characters, each deeply connected to their region and the woes that pervade it. And after a long and hard journey, those characters fade into obscurity. They're still around, but they're no longer the focus. They move to a supporting role, showing up only now and again, maybe getting their own side quest if they're lucky. Lise was the main character of Stormblood, and now she only has a passing role in a role quest or two. This is natural, and probably for the best. I know a lot of people bemoan the lack of fan favorites like Yugiri and Raoban, but those characters had their time in the sun. Their story is over, and they have no reason to invest themselves in new adventures in new lands, and that's fine. But 14 is a story-based game. Unlike other long-running games, it has to prioritize story over the rest of its content. Its main draw isn't the world, nor the combat. It can't afford to release an expansion with the sole draw being a new biome, nor can it vault all of its content after like 2 fucking years. Destiny 2, no, we let that go. And all of that means that it needs characters that don't lose relevance at the end of each expansion. It needs characters that can remain relevant in any land, in any story. What Final Fantasy XIV needs is the Scions of the Seventh Dawn are introduced in A Realm Reborn as a group of adventurers hunting down primals. They have connections with Sharlayan, an island nearby filled with scholars, as well as the events that occurred in 1.0. They act as a supporting cast for A Realm Reborn. They accompany the player on different missions to different sections of Eorzea, until a cinematic, climactic culmination leads to most of them being wiped out. After this, the Warrior of Light teams up with Alphinaud, who at this point is only tangentially related to the Scions, and we move to a section of downtime for the Scions, eventually reuniting with them and bringing us to the end of ARR, where we defeat La Habrea, the true threat behind the primals. After this, we kind of pan away from the Scions. We focus more on Alphinaud and his endeavors to create the Crystal Braves, an organization focused on doing good, built after the Scions' own image. Sure, they're still around, but they're not particularly emotionally relevant, though they were never that in the first place due to all the other issues with ARR. But that does change when we receive the dreaded message. Multiple cutscenes will now play in sequence. Please set aside sufficient time to view them all. After this cutscene, after the end of ARR, the Scions are gone. They vanish, each being either presumed dead or disappeared off the face of the world. Their story could have ended there. We move through Heavensward until, towards the end of that expansion, we start to bring them back. But they're different now. They have better voice acting. We've had more time to connect with them, to become their friends. And after recovering them one by one, they get reintroduced with more charisma, more character. The Scions evolve, and with their initial story closed, we now see them open to ever more possibility. They have motivations, goals, which are allowed to expand beyond the initial scope of their conception. They become characters that can move between expansions. While the read of events I provided for ARR are not entirely accurate, the Scions were definitely set up initially to be long-running characters, and they do have some interesting stuff here and there. They only really become the true core of the franchise after being reintroduced in Heavensward, after what happened in 2.5. The Scions become a band unlike most in fiction. The closest thing I could relate them to would be the crew of the Sunny in One Piece. Characters that are both interesting in and of their own regard, while also being flexible enough to fit perfectly as the primary focus of any story. After evolving past their initial scope and being allowed time to grow, each gains all of the traits necessary to act as a long-term supporting character. Now, what are those traits? How do we determine if a character has the potential to be S tier? Well, there are 4 traits that have to be present for that to happen. The first is adaptability. Any character that wants to be S tier must be able to adapt to any story. They need to have the skills to contribute regardless of the scenario, as well as the motivation that can be applied in any story. Alphinaud wants to save people through discourse. This can be applied in any setting he finds himself in. The second quality that we're looking for is interest. This character must possess a theme or some quality that allows their story to be relevant in any scenario. Their goals must align in a way that allows them to have an arc even in a story that does not focus on them. Then there's distance. An S-tier character must have a certain distance from most places. They can have a home and characters that relate to them, but they can't be too obligated to that location. Otherwise, this story will encounter friction when they try and leave. Lise, when taking her own spot in the story, developed too close a connection to Alamigo, and thus could no longer be an S-tier character. If she ever was one in the first place, that's debatable. But in being so close to Alamigo, she got a great story. even though she lost her ability to remain in the S tier. The final quality we're looking for in an S tier character is zest. Are they interesting? Do they have enough quirks and idiosyncrasies to be interesting and engaging in all the stories to come? Do the audience care enough about them, find their presence more engaging than if they weren't there in the first place? Urianger initially struggled with this, but as time progressed, he got more and more. His connection to Moon Brita, his funny dialogue that, while initially grating, just becomes funnier over time. And so he becomes S tier. And now we have all the qualities that we need to determine if a character is S tier. And we can easily remember all these qualities with the funny little acronym. Wait, nope, not that way. Let's just shift it around. There, that's better. Zaddy. A Zaddy is a character capable of being in the S tier, and all of the scions are, in fact, Zaddies. Alright, now we've identified the scions as S tier and what makes them so perfect for 14. The real question now is, what do we do with them? How does Square Enix use these characters to make the story better? Well, there are a few things we should keep in mind. A Zaddy is a main character. The scions are, in any given scene, the most interesting character there. We have had so much time with them, have such a connection with them, that they immediately draw attention when they're in a scene. They take up space. Even if the writers don't want them to, they take up space. This means that scions and all Zaddies have a difficult time acting as side characters. A good example of this can be found in a lot more of the recent side story content. Take Myths of the Realm, where we see Graha acting as kind of a side character, but even there, he still draws attention. We spend time on his cute little ear wiggles, on him being so excited about exploring and doing an adventure with us. He has to be one of the main components of this quest because he has so much development. When you try and put a scion in a storyline but keep them in the background, it tends not to end up working that well. They always end up drawing attention. I think the best example of this can be found in the first half of Dawntrail, where, in my opinion, the twins are not used very well. Alphino and Alisaie are characters built around helping people. Alfie tries to help on an institutional level. Alisaie tries to help on an individual level. Yet, at the start of Dawntrail, they don't have anyone to help, like, at all. As we enter the different tribes and do the different feats, the twins end up just drawing attention, throwing out filler dialogue, and we end up feeling sad because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not having enough of an impact. At the same time, they're also just drawing attention away from the characters we want to see developed. Trial, Erenville, they don't get enough screen time because the twins end up taking time away that we should have spent developing those two. When a Zaddy is not given enough time in the spotlight, they shouldn't even be on stage. Even if we like seeing them, they should not be included in every storyline. At the start of Endwalker, I remember hearing a lot of talk about how one of the scions ought to die in this finale expansion. And personally, I don't think that's good. It's kind of stupid. We've established that the character is the basic unit of storytelling. This means that every character has value. This value is in what they can add to the story, the emotions that they can evoke, and the actions that they can take going forward. When a character dies, all of that future potential value is lost. This means when you kill off a character as a writer, you want to do it in a way that reaps the value they would have. Ideally, you want to kill off a character in a way that gains more value from their death than they could have remaining in their life. You need more value than all of the future possible storylines they could ever be involved in. This becomes difficult when we look at S-tier characters, like a Scion, because their value is theoretically limitless. There's a moment in Shadowbringers where Thancred is facing off against Ranjit, and he becomes really close to death. Now, a lot of people think it would have been cool if Thancred died here. I disagree. It may have been cool for a time, but in 5 or 10 years, would it still have been worth one cool moment so long in the past? What would have been bought by Thancred dying against Ranjit? It would have made his character nothing more than some part of Reen's development, right? Would it have been worthwhile to make Thancred just another part of Reen's character? Would it have elevated Reen from A tier to S tier character? I don't think so. On a side note, I do think Reen is kind of already S tier and should really be brought back into the storyline. Reen and Gaia for lesbian power couple of 8.0. But again, I digress. In the same way, all of the scions end up not being worth killing, unless it would set up another S tier character or a villain that would span multiple expansions. It's not really worth having one of the scions die because they're just so valuable. They have so much potential that it can't be squandered as something as simple as elevating the stakes. The stakes aren't worth it. And besides, there are about 6 billion random A tier characters that we don't really need anymore. Like a good example of this is Harshaphon. I love Harshaphon, he's my boy. But he wasn't S tier. His story was integrally linked to Ishgard. And as we moved on from Ishgard, his story started coming to a close. The future of his story was small, and to save him pales in comparison to how he was used to set up the stakes of the final battle of Heavensward. It was a worthwhile trade from a narrative perspective. Just from a narrative perspective, I still cry, but if I look at it objectively, I can see it was worthwhile. Would it have been worthwhile to kill the scions, or even a single scion, at the end of Endwalker, just to close out an already closing story? I don't think so. Medion didn't need to be set up as a larger villain, and the death of a scion wouldn't do anything profound to the themes of the Hydaelyn saga. It wouldn't have been worth killing off a scion. Now, looking to the future, I do think there could be a time when the scion could die, if it sets up a new S tier character or a multi-expansion villain worthy of their sacrifice. If one of their eternal arcs comes to a natural and fulfilling culmination, they might be dead. But as of right now, they're just worth so much more alive. So there we have it, right? The Scions are perfect characters for 14. They're our Straw Hat crew, our franchise players. If they get used correctly, they can help us go into any expansion, any future story, and make it incredible in the best way that 14 expansions can be. As long as they remain in the spotlight and are used with care, then 14's character problem is already solved. All right, end of the video. Thanks for watching, Void. I appreciate it. Anything I forgot to say? Oh, Erenville for next Scion. He's been set up perfectly over the course of the last 2 expansions. He doesn't really have a strong connection to any location, and he's funny in a way that's unique from the other Scions. And most of all, he fills a role that we don't already have. He's our Gatherer. I hope he stays around. Like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. I'll make more videos, probably, I guess. And that's about it. Take it easy.